of common sense, who became the driving forces behind America's independence movement and the advancement of personal freedoms. And now, would you please welcome Thomas Jefferson.
My dear citizens, let me say before I go on that I'm a very poor public speaker and a very shy man. I had a slight speech impediment, and I was so shy that I could not in my lifetime have presented myself in front of a group such as you. I will attempt to say a few words about the rights of man and my own role in the Declaration of Independence. And then I'm told this afternoon, if you wish to return, you'll have a chance to ask any questions you might wish of me and also of Citizen Paine. Let me, before talking about the Declaration of Independence, say a word or two about Thomas Paine. I first met him in the summer of 1776, the great year of our independence. I knew of his reputation. He had already, by then, published his famous tract, Common Sense. Common Sense probably did more to stir the emotions of the American people for liberty than anything that the founding fathers in Philadelphia might have done in Independence Hall. Paine had an enormous gift for incendiary prose, for reducing complex ideas to simple but still sensible statements, for coordinating whole swaths of Enlightenment ideas into phrases that were pregnant with meaning and revolutionary energy. This is an enormous gift, and I was enamored of it, and I asked to meet Citizen Paine and had that opportunity, and we became friends in the summer of 1776, and we were friends in different ways until his death in 1809. In fact, one of the most controversial acts of my presidency came early on. I was elected to the presidency in 1800. I took the oath of office in March of 1801. And Thomas Paine had recently been released by the radical movement of the French Revolution. He had been jailed and nearly executed by the rebels of France, who had gone well beyond the original revolutionary mission there. That revolution had soured and erupted into a reign of terror, and it had, in a sense, consumed its own best minds, almost including Thomas Paine's. And when I realized that Paine had finally been released, I wrote him a letter offering to send an official United States vessel from Baltimore or Philadelphia to France to collect him and bring him back to the United States. Well, that was virtually the most controversial thing I ever did as President of the United States. By this time, Paine had lost the confidence of the American people. He had done two things that offended the Americans. First of all, he had written a public letter harshly critical of General Washington. And to criticize George Washington was a fundamental mistake. And secondly, he had written a book called The Age of Reason, which was in many regards a sarcastic attack on received Christianity. Those two affronts corroded Paine's reputation in the United States, and friends, lifetime friends like Samuel Adams, refused ever again to be in the same room with him. But I felt that he was a national hero, that he had done great things for us at a time of crisis in 1776 and beyond. And so I offered to send this little vessel to collect him and bring him back. And the Federalist Party, the other party, I was a Republican, the Federalist Party was the party of Washington and John Adams and Rufus King and, above all, Alexander Hamilton. That party erupted in anger and dismay when I befriended Paine. In the end, to save me, Paine decided to come back to the United States in a private vessel. But when he reached America, he stayed with me in the White House for a couple of weeks. And again, this produced enormous assault by the Federalist press. And I will say, without wishing to betray my own character, that it became necessary for me at this period to detach myself somewhat from Thomas Paine, because he had become so controversial that if I had embraced him more completely, as I would have liked to have done, it might have engulfed my presidency and made it impossible for my political party, the Republicans, to make important changes in American public life. And so when I realized how controversial he had become, I carefully separated myself a bit from him, at least publicly. One more thing about Thomas Paine: he also inadvertently helped to create the first breach between myself and John Adams. John Adams was a superb man. I'll say more about him in a moment, but he did not effectively believe in democracy. Adams believed that the people are self-interested, selfish, greedy, that there's a rage for distinction, that man is a glory-seeking animal, and that therefore every constitution must take into account these bad energies that circulate in human nature. He wrote extensively on this subject, did John Adams. And for this he was labeled a monarchist and a Tory and an aristocrat. And some of these charges were exaggerated, but the fact is that John Adams had considerable doubts about whether we could be a democracy. He had written a series of newspaper articles as the Vice President of the United States under George Washington that labeled him in many circles as a monarchist and a Tory. About this time, Thomas Paine's book, The Rights of Man, was published, a stirring articulation of the fact that we are born with rights. Copies were very limited in the United States. Mr. Madison, my dearest friend, had one. He gave it to me. I read The Rights of Man quickly. And then I was to send it on to a printer in Philadelphia. And to take off a little of the tedium of simply forwarding this, I wrote a cover letter with the book and said I was glad to see that some of the political heresies that had sprung up in the United States were now refuted by the author of Common Sense. Well, unfortunately, the printer of The Rights of Man decided to use my letter as a kind of endorsement of this book. And so, in a sense, he leaked this private letter into public print without my authorization. And in doing so, created a firestorm of controversy. Adams was upset. His feelings were hurt. We were friends. He was not used to being talked about publicly by a friend in this way. Everyone knew that the heresies that I was pointing to were the heresies of John Adams. And the Federalists and the Republicans, although those parties hadn't really gelled fully yet, were at each other's throats about this issue. Really two issues. One is, what do gentlemen do when they disagree fundamentally about political questions? How should gentlemen who live in a polite society agree to quarrel with each other about the future of human liberty? That's a question that my age wrestled with and didn't fully solve. And the second question was, what sort of a nation are we going to be? Now that we have freed ourselves from England, a relatively simple process. Now that we are the world's first republican society, how should we shape our public life? What sort of constitution is best for us? How much freedom can we really absorb? How capable is man of self-government? What happens if we remove the traditional shackles of authority and liberate mankind to express himself in any way he wishes? Is it chaos and pandemonium, as Mr. Hamilton would predict? Or is it something like utopia? Well, nobody knew. The quarrel was not just for the future of public offices like the presidency and the vice presidency and so on. The quarrel was for the future of human liberty itself. And we were carefully experimenting with a system of constitutional government that had never been tried in the history of the world. That's why passions were so strident. That's why friends broke with each other and crossed the street to avoid having to greet each other in public. And that's why the politics of my era seem so vicious to you when you read about them in your history books, because we believed that the world was watching, and that if we failed to create a self-governing society, then the rest of the world, the Frances and the Prussias and the Spains and the Englands and the Italys, would look on us and say, well, mankind wanted an experiment in self-government. We have given mankind that experiment. It has failed. We don't need to try that again. We can go back to more monarchical, more aristocratical, more hierarchical systems, because they at least provide order, and order matters in human affairs. And so we felt that we were the centerpiece of a worldwide experiment in potential democracy. And nobody did more to forward that vision than Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine had only one serious character flaw, in my view, and that is that he lacked decorum. He said whatever was on his mind. And in doing so, he failed to realize that the people can only stand so much revolutionary energy at any given time, that the people need to be brought along carefully and slowly, that we need to stay close to the will of the people, that we can't simply tell them what a just world should look like. We need to bring them with us. We should, as leaders, never arrogate to ourselves that we are wiser than the people. We should constantly be working on the arts of persuasion so that we evolve as a society together. So Paine, in leaping over some of these hurdles and insisting upon principles which I happen to agree with, but felt were perhaps premature or indecorously published, Paine brought heaps of anger and opprobrium upon his head. And so in a sense, he lacked a kind of grace. And grace is one of the capacities of leadership, knowing how much the people can stand. I said, when I was first elected to the presidency, we must never do more than the people can bear. The art of political wisdom is the art of the practicable. Great leaders need to see far. They need to have a vision of an enlightened society, but they need to move with the people as we slowly become more rational, more sensible, more just, more scientific, and more equal. Well, let me turn very briefly to the Declaration of Independence. In 1776, I was the youngest member of the Virginia delegation to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. I've already told you how shy a man I was, how poor a public speaker, how indifferent to political ambition that I was. And here I was, a very young man, a provincial from the mountains of Virginia, a kind of almost a savage from the woods of Virginia, who had suddenly been sent to Philadelphia as a member of the Second Continental Congress to represent the interests of my country, Virginia. And when I took my seat there, I realized immediately that I had established a reputation for two things. This had occurred while I was a statesman in Virginia, but the news had traveled off to Philadelphia. My first reputation was for being a man deeply versed in the history of ideas, that I was, in a sense, in an age of intellectuals, and intellectuals intellectual, that I was deeply studied in the history of liberty and the history of governments and the history of political systems, that I was a classicist, and that nobody in America, with the possible exception of John Adams, had read more about man's struggle to be taken seriously as a human being. And so the first reputation that I had developed was for being a serious student. When I was your age, young people in this room, I was reading about 15 hours per day. The second reputation that I had established was for being a clear writer of English prose. I had written a pamphlet called A Summary View, which was about the rights of Americans as against the British Constitution, and that pamphlet had circulated very widely and had given me a reputation for lucidity. In fact, John Adams said later that I had what he called a peculiar felicity for expression. So those two things, serious study, deep grounding in the history of natural law on the one hand, and an ability to express those ideas in clear, unambiguous language. That's what gave me this assignment. What happened was that a Resolution of Independence was introduced on June 7th, 1776. Time was needed to bring all of the different state delegations into harmony on this question. To buy time and to prepare the way for this inevitability, a committee was made up to draft a Declaration of Independence. Originally, there were 5 members of this committee. It soon became just 3 of us, and the 3 of us were Dr. Franklin, John Adams, and myself. Now, Franklin, in my view, was the greatest American, greater even than George Washington. Maybe the greatest man of the 18th century anywhere in the world. He should have written this document. He was famous for his capacities as a storyteller and a wit and a man of persuasiveness. But Franklin was elderly and his health was in jeopardy. And he decided he did not want to draft the Declaration of Independence. In fact, he said that he would never again be willing to undertake any assignment that was subject to committee review. So the man who should have written the Declaration of Independence withdrew immediately. I worshiped Franklin, scientist, diplomat, printer, Constitution maker. That left John Adams and me. John Adams should have written the Declaration of Independence because he was 8 years older than I was, and he was much more central to the revolution than I was. I'm a peripheral figure in the revolution, not Adams. He fought every day on the floor of Congress. But he came to my boarding house. I was staying in a room in a boarding house on Market Street in Philadelphia, and he came to see me one morning shortly after the assignment had come to us, and he said, "You, Mr. Jefferson, must write this document." I said, "Why do you say that?" Adams said, 3 reasons. First, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian must be at the head of this business. The thought was that the revolution was being perceived as a Massachusetts or a sectional dispute. By bringing Virginians like Washington and me into the picture, Adams and others at Congress were widening the revolution. We're showing that this was a continental cause and not simply a New England outbreak. First, you are a Virginian, he said, and a Virginian must be at the head of this business. Second, he said, I, John Adams, am disliked and obnoxious. And if I write this document, it will not have credibility. People will quarrel with it just because they dislike me. And third, he said, you write 10 times better than I do. Well, finally, I agreed to do it. And then I went into my room alone, and I put a plain sheet of paper in front of me on a desk that I had designed. And consulting neither book nor pamphlet, I simply wrote out the common sense of the subject. What any one of you would have written had you been called upon on this occasion. No, I'm quite serious. This was not a moment for personal philosophy or one's idiosyncratic notions of government or solecisms of any sort. This was a time to express the common sense of the subject in terms so articulate that they would command assent. It was to be an expression of the American mind. It was a distillation of the ideas of the Enlightenment. The Declaration of Independence is really a kind of logical syllogism. A syllogism is a piece of sort of scholastic logic. It works like this. The Declaration of Independence says, under certain conditions, a people have a right to overthrow their government. Number two, those conditions have been met. Now the conclusion. Because under certain conditions, people have a right to overthrow an oppressive government. And because it is clear that the government that has coordinated our lives is oppressive, we now, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, do overthrow the British government and do institute our own government. So people have a right to revolution under certain conditions. Those conditions had been very amply met by the oppressions of the British Crown and the British Parliament. In a sense, we had no choice. That's the logic of the Declaration of Independence. The heart of the Declaration of Independence is an 18-point indictment of George III for his crimes against the American people, stripping us of our rights, quartering troops in our houses, when we're tried, taking us out of our localities, shipping us across to England and trying us there, not with a jury of our peers, but with a jury of British dandies. A whole series of abuses, stirring up the Indians in the West to massacre our settlers, stirring up our Negro slaves to revolt against their masters. A whole range of crimes against the American people. The part that you remember of the Declaration of Independence, the preamble, was not famous in my time. It has become famous in the course of American history, but at the time, the famous sentences beginning, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," and so on. Those sentences were seen in my time, and I don't mean to sound cynical, but they were seen as Enlightenment boilerplate. Pleasantries, commonplaces, the kinds of things you'd find in a commonplace book or a book of quotations about human rights. So you now honor the preface, the preamble, and I thank you for that. You seldom, if ever, read the indictment of George III, but that was the part that was so revolutionary in my time. And of course, the Declaration of Independence ends with the United States declaring itself a free nation, capable of levying taxes, capable of raising troops, capable of engaging in relations with foreign powers. Well, let me quickly speed to the end and say two more things about this. Number one, most Americans did not know that I was the author of the Declaration of Independence. It was adopted on the 4th of July, 1776. It was published the same day. It became, in the course of my lifetime, the most famous document of the Revolution. But very few people during my lifetime knew that I was the principal author of this work. It was seen as a committee piece. Number two, if the Americans of my era had known, and particularly if the famous men of the Continental Congress, John Hancock and John and Samuel Adams and others, had known that this document would go on to become the most famous document in the history of human liberty, I can assure you that they would not have permitted me to write it. In other words, there's a paradox here. If they had known how famous it would become, the assignment would have gone to a more ambitious man. Because at the time it was seen as a routine state paper that any junior member of the Congress could handle. And finally, let me say this. The question of American history, a question which continues to bedevil you in 2002, is how to read the following sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. If you had backed me into a corner, sat me down and refused to let me go, and said, Mr. Jefferson, you must tell us what you meant by that sentence, I would have tried anything to avoid answering. But if you had forced me to answer, I would have said this: every human being, irrespective of the accident of his birth, black or white or red, male or female, Jew or Gentile or Baptist or Quaker or Zoroastrian, every human being who is accidentally born on earth should, in the machine of the law, be treated identically with any other human being who appears before that machine. In other words, in the eyes of justice, in the eyes of the Creator, in the eyes of the ideal society, each one of us has identical legal rights. Now, if I had said that, frankly, at the Continental Congress, the Declaration of Independence would never have passed into law. And so I left the phrase ambiguous so that each section of the country, each individual there, could read that sentence the way he needed to in order to endorse this document. But the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln is implicit in that phrase, although I would perhaps not have intended it in my own lifetime. The enfranchisement of women by way of constitutional amendment is implicit in that phrase. The inclusion of the American Indian as citizens of the United States under the Snyder Act in 1924 is implicit in that phrase. That phrase, all men are created equal, all human beings are created equal, has universalist and indeed limitless application. But most of those applications had not come about in my time, and frankly would have been resisted by many of the founding fathers, and frankly some of them by me. And so this is a phrase that has gone on to wider and wider application, and it has almost in your time reached its logical universality. But it has been selectively applied in the course of American history according to what any given society in America has been able to accept. And that, I think, is the genius of it, and also its revolutionary energy. Well, now please welcome a man much more happy to address a public audience, Thomas Paine.
Good morning, my dear fellow citizens. Thank you for the warm welcome. It's a great privilege and honor to be here this morning. Really, it's a double honor to be here, first and foremost to share this podium with my dear friend Thomas Jefferson, who was my friend throughout life. And the second honor is to be able to speak to you today about independent liberty, a subject very close to my heart. But as I say, first, to share the stage with Thomas Jefferson, as he pointed out and so kindly said, we spent a great deal of our life together and saw many of the greatest scenes of the Revolution together. First, in 1776, at the time of the writing and drafting of the Declaration. He's been justly given credit for the writing of it. After all, it was his pen that did so. But it was the act of a group of people. And as he pointed out, common sense had a great deal to do with it. It was really the foundation that allowed that declaration to be written. The second time that I spent a good deal of time with Citizen Jefferson was in France, just before the French Revolution. I was there to promote my iron bridge. You do know that I was an inventor as well, don't you? I invented the first single-span, single-arch iron bridge, and I was there to bring it before the French Academy of Sciences. And Thomas was there as the consul to America. We spent many an evening together, dining, talking the news of the day, what was going to happen in Europe at that time. And we would walk arm in arm in the evening by the Seine River in those warm Parisian nights. The French press and the French people idolized us, and we were called the Two Toms. And we were described walking along the river. It's funny, I notice coming back to America, I don't see men walking arm in arm. And when I pointed out that to a friend of mine, asking if it was a fashion or prohibited by law or something, he said that I might have to go to San Francisco to see such a thing. I'm not really aware of the significance of that, but that will go for another day. And then the third time was, as he said, when I came back to the United States with the howl of the Federalist press that the infidel Thomas Paine would be meeting the infidel Thomas Jefferson in the White House, and what a disgrace that was. I have to make a little quibble with Thomas, though. The American people were not alienated from me. The Federalist faction hated me, and they hated Thomas Jefferson. But those who were dedicated to liberty and to the ideals that we stood for welcomed me back. I was there to fight for them and to defend them, and Thomas Jefferson along with them. And Citizen Jefferson is correct that I do trust the people. I really believe that if the people have the correct information, the right amount of knowledge, that they would unerringly make the correct decision. I was amused at his statement that we should only give the people as much government as they can stand, because to me that turns government on its head. Government derives from the people, not from the aristocracy, and not from the elite. And in that we differed, though we were friends. As I say, the second honor is to talk about individual liberty, a subject dear to my heart. I lived my life for individual liberty, and I wrote my works with that goal in mind. But never for liberty in and of itself. Hear me, never for liberty in and of itself. I wrote these words in the dissertation on First Principles of Government, probably my favorite work. When we speak of a right, we ought always to unite it with the idea of duties. Rights become duties by reciprocity. The right which I enjoy becomes my duty to guarantee it to another, and he to me. And those who violate the duty justly incur a forfeiture of the right. So it was never liberty for liberty's sake. It was never about mobocracy. It was all about the rights and duties of a citizen in a free society. I want to tell you just as quickly as I can, because, you know, for bringing me back from eternity, they've certainly given us a short time to speak to you this morning. But as briefly as I can, I want to tell you a little bit about how it was in my day. Perhaps you'll appreciate more how it is in your day today, and then make a couple of quick comments about my impressions upon returning from such a distance. You have no idea what it was like in those days. It was a species of slavery from top to bottom. Of course, we all know about African slavery, but I'm not sure many of you know that I wrote an essay called African Slavery in America that was the first really strident call for the abolition of slavery and the manumission of all slaves immediately, and condemned it for what it was, a blight and a stain upon humanity and upon our nation. I never held a slave. You know that Citizen Jefferson did, and in many respects that describes the difference. He was always much more cautious than I, a good man, but cautious where I never have been. Women's rights. Well, with very, very few exceptions, there were none. Women were listed as chattels along with the rest of a man's property. Do you know what chattel means? It comes from the old word in English that means cattle, and it describes a person's movable possessions. And a woman was described as such and took little part, if any at all, in civil society, certainly not voting, certainly not speaking in public assembly, with the occasional exception of a religious assembly. And if a man had a quarrel with his wife and she spoke to him crossly, were he to beat her, very likely there would be no result from it. Free speech. Do you not know that I wrote my first essays, as did all the men of the time, with a pen name, a nom de plume? Can you imagine why that was? The reason is that to speak against the system of things, and specifically to speak against monarchy, was sedition and treason, and it was a hangable offense. So virtually all the men of my time wrote under a pen name. We had to. And free speech where religion is concerned was simply non-existent. Only Christians were protected in this country, and from state to state that varied tremendously. Why, Pennsylvania, as you may know, was a Quaker state and established as such, but right next door in Massachusetts, it was a death offense to be a Quaker. Let me read you a couple of accounts from the day, remembering that the cage, the stocks, heavy fines, branding, having your nose slit or your ear cut off, and public whippings were the customary reprisal for violations of blasphemy or the Sunday laws, simply failing to attend church. The penalty for swearing in Maryland for first offense was to have a hole bored in your tongue. The second offense was to have your ear cut and the letter B branded on your forehead. And the third offense was death, simply for swearing, which incidentally, because of my Quaker upbringing, I never did. But I always thought those offenses were ridiculously out of line. This was an insanity, the kind of insanity that stood in the place of government in my day. Anyone who believes that this country was founded on some kind of a religious state is a buffoon. We made absolutely certain that no religion would ever be at the center of this government. We had good reason to do so. No, there was precious little freedom, and that's why I published Common Sense, which Citizen Jefferson was kind enough to tell you really set the stage for our revolution. But I didn't just simply write. The minute hostilities broke out actively, I enlisted, and I served for a time as the aide-de-camp of General Nathaniel Greene, one of our greatest patriots and greatest generals. And at that time, I served in our darkest hour. You know, that was not Valley Forge, as is popularly assumed. The darkest moment of the Revolution was when General Washington's troops were retreating out of New York and across the New Jersey swamp and deserting by the thousands. Yes, I had the temerity to criticize Washington. Think about this. At the beginning of the war, he took all of our troops, virtually all of them in any case, and put them on the island of Manhattan at a time when Britain ruled the high seas. How wise was that? It took them but a few days to drive him off the island. They could have cut him off, starved them out, or burned them as they wished. And they barely made it over the bridge at Hackensack and onto the frozen swamps of New Jersey as it was. And we retreated pell-mell, an untrained, unclothed mob, really, across the frozen swamps of New Jersey. People's toes froze off, their feet froze off, their noses froze. They had no food. They were ill from the water. They deserted in droves. And it was a horrible moment. Men of the time said that the revolution was lost before it was even begun. And Nathaniel Greene and others asked me if I would take pen again and write. And so by the light of a fire, I sat down, and on the head of the drum I wrote the Crisis Papers, the first of the American crisis. You probably know these words better than just about any that I've written. They begin, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he who stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, and yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated." That essay, I'm proud to say, rallied the troops that were left, and it brought back a good many of the deserters who were trudging through the frozen roads on their way back home and heard it read in a public house or a post house or in a city square as they were trying to get back home. It shamed them, it reminded them of the real cause, the real stake, and it brought them back. Before our revolution was even completed, for I knew, as did others of the time, that it was not just a revolution for us, but that the cause of America was in large part the cause of the world, I decided to go back to Britain and to see if I could strike a further spark there and perhaps cut the head off of the monarchic system that ruled over everything in our time. You might say finish the job that our revolution began. And while in England, I wrote The Rights of Man, which had almost as great a run as Common Sense. You know, Common Sense was the greatest seller in history. It sold 120,000 copies in the first 3 months of publication. At a time when there were barely 2 million people in North America, to match that today, you would have to sell 97 million copies, by my calculation, in North America in 3 months. And The Rights of Man was hungered after and thirsted after nearly as much. It sold a couple of 100,000 that fast, and I took all the money from that and rolled it back into an inexpensive publication which sold for 6 cents and sold all over Britain. You know, I never took a penny from any of the works. I could have been wealthy from Common Sense alone, but that money I took and donated to our revolutionary troops for mittens and socks so they would not freeze. And I refused to take any money for the Rights of Man. It seemed to me that it would pervert the cause to do so. Well, of course, the British Crown was not thrilled that I had written that book, and a price was put upon my head. And one night, William Blake came to me and told me, "Thomas, if you do not leave tonight, you will be arrested in the morning and you will be hung." And so I, along with Achille and a good friend of mine, John Frost, fled from London and rowed down to the sea at Dover, where we consigned a ship. We had a little run-in with the King's men there that we barely escaped from, but got across the sea, across the English Channel, I should say, to Calais in France, where I was received as a hero, a world hero. And at that time, you know, we were the name that were on everyone's lips, like Madonna would be today. I was received as a hero. We were borne ashore to a huge reception, military bands, the governors of the local districts, the mayor of the city, the most beautiful woman pinned the revolutionary cockade upon my hat. And I was elected to from four departments to the Revolutionary French Convention, accepted that of Calais, and went off to Paris to take my seat in the French Convention, where I wrote, along with Condorcet and Danton, the first French Revolutionary Constitution, an act of which I am most proud. I still believe it was their best constitution. not least because it recognized every single citizen as a voter and a participant in civil society. Of course, you know, at that time, the King of France had tried to flee to the lowlands where he hoped to get an army to come back and to crush the revolution and execute its leaders. He was captured before he could leave France and brought back to stand before the assembly, where the most radical of the lot wanted to execute him by cutting his head off. I stood and spoke before that assembly, and I pled for the king's life. It seemed to me rankest hypocrisy to eliminate the stupid, imbecilic, stinking system of monarchy, the murderous, bloody system of monarchy, upon yet another murder. Would that not make us the same as the kings themselves? I argued rather it would be wiser to send the king, to exile him, back to America, where he would learn the rights of a free citizen. That plea was ignored, however. Oftentimes in the heat of emotion, it's much more satisfying to have revenge, and the radicals wanted revenge. And after all, after hundreds of years of the oppression and murder of monarchy, one can hardly blame them, really. And so the king lost his head. And you might say the revolution did too as well, because it became extraordinarily bloody. Most people know about the terror. And once again, for my honesty and for my truth, I was jailed. I was thrown in the dungeon in Luxembourg, where I rotted and became incredibly ill. I nearly died. I was unconscious for a large portion of my imprisonment. I survived really by a miracle. I don't know if you've heard the story or not, but as I say, I was deathly ill. The conditions were horrendous. It was winter. We had no heat. The water was foul. Many people died from it, from typhoid and other diseases. And one of the men that I was imprisoned with was a gentleman from Brussels who had enough money to bring a physician down to the prison. And the physician was an admirer of mine and treated me. And while they were there, the door was opened. It was the custom of the jailers to come down at night and to mark the doors with a chalk mark, and they would come down the next morning and take out the men who were to be beheaded, which incidentally were all of my friends. I saw them all killed. And so, as I say, the door was opened, the mark was made. When the physician left, the door was closed, and the mark was inside. And so the next morning, when the jailers came down to remove us from the prison, the avenging angel passed by my door, and I was spared. And bloody Robespierre, the one who had ordered my arrest and execution, was himself killed 3 days hence. I suppose that those whose only ideology and belief is to live by the blade must also die by it as well, and Robespierre did. Nevertheless, there was no order for my release, so I rotted another month or 6 weeks in prison until another good friend, James Monroe, later president, you know, rescued me from the dungeon, and with his own hands and by the hand of his wife, tenderly nursed me back to health again. I was asked one more time to stand before the French Convention, which had written yet another constitution, which had divested everyone of the vote, everyone of the suffrage in France, except male property owners. And so, really too ill to be there, but I did appear, and too sick to make my own speech. I had another man make it for me. I spoke to the French Convention again and said that that Constitution would not stand and that it would lead to more bloodshed unless universal suffrage was recognized. Every citizen should have the right to vote. The French Convention once again ignored my advice, and as you may know, that was not the last revolution that France suffered. I returned, as Citizen Jefferson mentioned to you, finally in 1802, 14 years after our revolution, to a country that was split and divided horribly. John Adams, who we fondly called his rotundity, had tried to have himself made king, I believe that Citizen Jefferson was too kind to them, frankly. Adams and Hamilton were monarchists. We have it in their writings. They did not believe that people can be trusted with government, and they really believed that they should rule the country. And while he was president, Adams tried to have himself made a monarch. You've heard of the Alien and Sedition Acts, haven't you? The Alien Acts made it difficult for an alien to become a citizen of the United States because new citizens were bringing new blood, and our own aristocracy was afraid they would be turned out of office. Adams certainly was. And the Sedition Acts made it illegal for someone to speak against either the president or his policies. Did you know that newspaper editors all over this country were jailed in horrendous conditions and suffered horribly simply for writing articles critical to the United States? I was shocked upon my return this time in the year 2002 to hear the Republican leader of your Congress suggest that anyone who criticized the president or his policy should be considered a traitor or out of line with American thought. How ironic to hear those words after 200 years. Well, that's how it was back then. Did you know that 25,000 of your countrymen died in the Revolutionary War that you might be here today and enjoy the freedoms that you have, many times so little regarded? 25,000. The cost was dear, and nearly every family in the country lost loved ones to the great battle of liberty. We laid that foundation. We laid the foundation for everything which we now see and for the progress of individual liberty in the last 200 years. Briefly, because I think time probably, as it always is flying, I want to share just a couple of comments about how I find the country today. Probably the most encouraging thing that I have seen is the elevation of the place in society of women. I hated the fact that women were not recognized for their accomplishments and not taken on an equal footing. I wrote about it throughout my life. An occasional letter on the female sex is one of the most famous of my letters, but I wrote it over and over again. To see that women finally have an equal opportunity for education and are oftentimes recognized for their true accomplishments in this world and respected for more than their beauty and gentleness, which nature seems to have given them in greater share than men. To see them recognized on that platform is probably the most heartwarming thing that I've encountered upon my return this time. The Negroes and other minorities in this country, similarly, as you know, it's not been an easy road in either case. We had more Americans that died in the Civil War than all wars combined. The fields of the entire eastern border of the United States are fertilized with the blood of Americans that died in the Civil War, but it has paid off. And while things are far from perfect today, as I think any of you would recognize, it's striking to me that our Secretary of State is a man of color. That could have never happened in my time. They would have drug him out and hung him. Travel is amazing. In the time that it would take us to get from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., you can get nearly halfway around the world. I truly cannot wrap my mind around that fact. And the internet is an extraordinary thing. Think about this. I set the world on fire with one small pamphlet. What is the power of the internet? Where a man or a woman may speak either openly and boldly by their own name or in secret, if they wish, to thousands of people at a time. I was heartened. A friend of mine here in town who has a great interest on my life and works showed me a section of the internet for your Social Security system. If you'll go and look there, you'll find an essay of mine called Agrarian Justice. I was the first man to propose that society ought to provide both for the aged in their debility in later life, as well as for the young when they start out in life. And you'll find Agrarian Justice as one of the founding documents of the Social Security system. I'm very proud of that. The elderly in my day were horribly neglected, and at least we know that they, in most cases, will be fed and cared for today. And there is also, I might add, if you haven't seen it yet, a website, they call them, I believe, with my name on it. It's thomaspaine.org, and it's dedicated to all of the works and to, imagine that, dedicated to my works and to an account of my life, and I heartily recommend it, as I always do my own works. And now, just a couple of disturbing things that I see upon my return. I've already mentioned the Patriot Act. May I have a show of hands? Have any of you read it? I see not a hand in the crowd. One lawyer. Thank goodness for that. Because if you go to court under it, it'll be he who defends you. Haven't you even the courage to know your own laws? Especially a law called the Patriot Act that is not patriotic in any way, shape, or form, that divests whole classes of persons of their civil rights. And yet I see not a peep from the populace. I took a walk the last couple of evenings in your beautiful town. It's almost an ideal place, I think, in many respects. And I was surprised that as I walked the streets, there was almost no one in the evening out on the street. In my time, there would have been throngs of people. Not even a person on the porch. And when I did encounter the one or two people that I saw, they seemed afraid to say hello or good evening to me. Cautious or timorous. And yet, in every home that I walked by, there was a strange, ethereal, bizarre, blue light. I hear by your laughter you know whereof I speak. A friend showed me what it was. It's a television, you call it. And when I watched for a few minutes was all I could take. Somebody was constantly putting soap or cereal or hemorrhoid medicine or a diet or automobiles in front of my face. It was like being in a market and being confronted with hundreds of hucksters at the same time, or welcoming them into my home. I couldn't stand it, and I asked them to turn it off. Instead, they turned it to a public television station, which I was relieved to see seems to have some extraordinary value. But how disturbing to find that governmental support for the public television has been removed, or perhaps we should call it educational television, has been removed, and they have a hard time going from month to month or day to day. So what's least valued is held to highest esteem, and what is greatest valued is held to lowest. And at the same time, voter turnout, I am told, is as little as 10% in this country. Well, Mr. Stewart tells me my time's up. Eternity is once again beckoning. But in closing, I want to read to you just briefly a couple of thoughts that I wrote 200 years ago. 1,000 years hence, perhaps in less, America may be what Europe is now. The innocence of her character that won the hearts of nations to her favor may sound like a romance, and her inimitable virtue as if it had never existed. The ruin of that liberty which thousands bled and struggled to obtain may just furnish materials for a village tale or extort a sigh from rustic sensibility, while the fashionable of that day, enveloped in wealth and dissipation, shall deride the principles and deny the fact. When we contemplate the fall of empires and see the extinction of the nations of the ancient world, we see but little to excite than the moldering ruins of pompous palaces, magnificent museums, lofty pyramids, and the walls and towers of most costly workmanship. But when the empire of America shall fall, the subject for contemplative sorrow will be infinitely greater than crumbling brass or marble. It will not then be said, here stood a temple, or here rose a